There is a version of Irish history most people never hear. Not the one about famine ships or emerald hills, but an older one. A world of rival kings, sacred hilltops, and dynasties that ruled long before England ever cast a shadow over the island. And buried inside that world, hiding in plain sight on modern passports and gravestones, are names that once meant something close to power itself. Because in early medieval Ireland, a surname was rarely just a name. It was a claim, a record of descent from a specific ancestor, a specific kingdom, sometimes a specific king. The Irish surname system, formalized earlier than almost anywhere else in Europe, was built to preserve exactly this kind of memory, who your people were and who they had once answered to or ruled beside. At the center of that world stood the idea of the Ard Rí, the High King of Ireland, seated symbolically at the Hill of Tara. Historians have long debated how much real, unified power that title carried versus how much was later mythologized by medieval chroniclers eager to flatten a complicated patchwork of provincial kingdoms into a tidier story. That tension between the legend of a single high kingship and the messier reality of competing dynasties is exactly where this investigation begins. Because when you follow the surnames tied to that world, the truth turns out to be more layered and more interesting than the simple story of one throne and one crown. The accepted version goes like this. Ireland, before the Norman arrival in 1169, was organized into a shifting network of tuatha, small kingdoms, loosely bound under larger provincial overkings, who in turn sometimes acknowledged, sometimes fought, a high king based at Tara. Great dynasties rose to dominate the system for centuries at a time, most famously the Ui Níl, whose name alone would eventually produce one of the most recognizable surnames in the world. This was the framework medieval Irish historians and monastic annalists worked from, and for centuries it was treated as a mostly stable, if idealized, picture of how power moved through the island. But almost as soon as modern historians began cross-referencing the annals against archaeology, genealogy, and later DNA studies of Irish population history, cracks started to show. The high kingship, it turns out, was never quite the fixed institution later texts implied. Some high kings listed in medieval genealogies may have been retroactively elevated by scribes working centuries after the fact, tidying a violent, fragmented past into something that looked more like a continuous royal line. The annals do not fully agree with each other. And that disagreement is where the real story starts. That is the first anomaly worth sitting with. Not a contradiction from outside the tradition, but one buried inside it. The record itself is inconsistent about who ruled, when, and how legitimately. This is where science entered a conversation that had, for a very long time, belonged only to historians and genealogists. Population geneticists studying Irish Y chromosome lineages, the paternal line, passed largely unchanged from father to son, began noticing something remarkable. A specific genetic signature, now often referred to informally in the research literature as the Ui Níl modal haplotype, appeared at strikingly high frequency across parts of Ireland and among Irish diaspora populations, particularly in areas historically associated with Ui Níl power in the north and west. Researchers were cautious about what this meant. A shared Y chromosome signature does not, on its own, prove descent from any single named king. What it can suggest, statistically, is a dramatic founder effect, a single male lineage expanding rapidly across many generations, consistent with a politically and reproductively dominant dynasty. The evidence does not prove Níl of the 9 hostages existed exactly as later legend describes him. It complicates the question in a more interesting direction. Something like a powerful founding lineage clearly did exist, spreading its genetic signature across a huge portion of the population, whether or not every detail of the origin story survived intact. If you find this kind of quiet detective work in ordinary names as fascinating as I do, this is a good moment to subscribe, because almost every surname carries a piece of a story like this, waiting to be reopened. That single genetic finding did more than confirm a well-known dynasty. It reframed the entire question of what descended from a high king could even mean. Not a single bloodline, preserved perfectly through history like a sealed vault. Something messier, a genetic surge, radiating outward from a position of real power, absorbed into dozens of surnames as centuries of marriage, fosterage, and political alliance scattered it across the island. With that in mind, here are 15 surnames whose documented histories connect them, with varying degrees of certainty, to the world of Ireland's provincial and high kingships. O'Neill sits first, and most directly. Descending from the Neil dynasty itself, the name preserves, almost unaltered, the identity of the lineage most closely associated with the high kingship at Tara, and later with the powerful Senil Neogain kingdom in Ulster. O'Donnell follows closely, tied to the Senil Conaill branch of the same broader Neil federation, ruling for centuries in Tyrconnell before becoming one of Gaelic Ireland's last great ruling houses. O'Connor, or O'Concaber, traces to the kings of Connacht, a dynasty that eventually produced Ireland's last widely recognized high king, Ruaidhri Ua Concaber, who reigned in the turbulent years just before the Norman invasion reshaped the island's politics permanently. O'Brien, descending from Brian Borumha, perhaps the most famous high king in Irish history, credited in later tradition with breaking Neil dominance of the title entirely, carries one of the most historically documented royal associations of any Irish surname, even as some later embellishments to Brian's legend have been treated cautiously by modern historians. McCarthy descends from the kings of Desmond in southern Munster, a dynasty that maintained real regional power for centuries after the Norman arrival, never fully subdued in the way many other kingdoms were. MacMurrough carries a heavier, more complicated legacy, descending from the kings of Leinster, including Diarmait Mac Murchada, whose decision to seek Norman military help in a regional power struggle would end up changing the entire trajectory of Irish history. O'Rourke, tied to the kings of Bréifne, represents a dynasty whose repeated conflicts with neighboring kingdoms are recorded extensively in the annals, a reminder that plenty of powerful lineages never held the high kingship itself but shaped who did. Amalaglan, descending from the southern Neil and the kingdom of Meath, holds a particularly interesting position. This branch actually held the high kingship at multiple points, including briefly after Brian Borumha's death, before eventually losing prominence to more dominant rival houses. MacLaughlin, another branch of the northern Neil, produced high kings in the 12th century and remained one of the most powerful dynasties in Ulster right up until the Norman period disrupted the old order entirely. O'Toole and O'Byrne both descend from Leinster ruling families who, after being displaced from more fertile lowland territory following the Norman invasion, retreated into the Wicklow Mountains and continued to resist encroachment for centuries, a lineage less about the high kingship directly and more about the fierce persistence of provincial royal identity long after Tara's symbolic power had faded. O'Kelly, tied to the main kingdom in Connacht, represents one of the many secondary royal lines whose power was regional rather than national, but whose genealogies were meticulously preserved by hereditary poets and historians attached to the family for generations. O'Dowd and O'Flaherty, both associated with kingdoms in Connacht, illustrate something important about this whole picture. Provincial royalty was not a single ladder leading up to one throne. It was a wide, branching structure, where many families held real, documented kingship without ever holding, or perhaps even seeking, the high kingship itself. And finally, MacGogan, descending from another branch of the southern Neil in Westmeath, rounds out the list as a name whose royal documentation is strong at the regional level, even as its connection to the high kingship narrative remains, like so many others here, more indirect than direct. Laid out together, these 15 names do something the old, simplified story of the High Kings of Ireland never quite managed. They reveal a political landscape that was not a single line of succession, but an interlocking web of dynasties, some genuinely dominant across generations, some regionally powerful but nationally marginal, almost all of them eventually blurred together by centuries of intermarriage, fosterage, alliance, and war. This matters beyond genealogy. It is a small, specific example of something researchers keep rediscovering across human history in general, that power rarely moves in the clean, linear way later chroniclers prefer to describe it. Dynasties do not simply rise and fall in isolation. They tangle with each other, absorb each other, occasionally erase each other from the record entirely, and leave behind evidence. In this case, surnames and Y chromosome signatures, that is far messier and far more human than the tidy king list a medieval scribe might have preferred to write down. Picture, for a moment, the hill of Tara itself on a grey Irish morning. Low stone mounds rising out of wet grass, wind moving across a landscape that has been considered sacred for over 5,000 years, long before any of these dynasties existed at all. Standing there, it is easy to feel the pull of the old story, the idea of a single seat of power radiating out across the whole island. But archaeology tells a stranger truth. Tara's symbolic importance seems to have outlasted its practical political power by centuries. Kings continued to be inaugurated there, or claimed association with it, long after real authority had shifted elsewhere. The hill remained a kind of ancestral idea even as the reality of Irish kingship kept fracturing and reforming around it. That gap, between symbolic center and lived political reality, might be the truest inheritance carried by these 15 surnames. Not a guarantee of royal blood, cleanly transmitted across 1,000 years. Something closer to a set of coordinates, pointing back toward dynasties that were real, contested, occasionally mythologized, and ultimately woven so thoroughly into the wider Irish population that millions of people today carry a fragment of that history without ever having gone looking for it. If your surname is on this list, it does not hand you a crown or even a guaranteed royal ancestor. What it hands you is a thread worth pulling, a genuine documented connection to a world where kingship was earned in battle, negotiated in alliance, and remembered, imperfectly but persistently, in the names we still carry today. If that kind of hidden thread interests you, there is a great deal more of Irish history waiting in names most people walk past without a second thought.